poor rancher, etched by sun and solitude, built his cabin with hands scarred and resolute, shaping timber from the unforgiving earth. His life was a testament to endurance, a silent battle waged against the vast, indifferent landscape, until a mail-order bride, a woman he knew only from a faded daguerreotype, saw not merely the strength of his sinews, but the raw, unyielding power of a spirit forged in the fires of sorrow. The world often mistakes silence for weakness and solitude for emptiness, but in the desolate quiet of the ranch, his silence roared, and his solitude held secrets deeper than the well he dug by hand. This was a man who carried his past like the weight of the logs he hauled, each knot a memory, each splinter a forgotten pain, building not just a shelter for his body, but a fortress around his heart. The very air around him hummed with the untold stories of a life lived on the fringes, of dreams abandoned and hopes resurrected, then abandoned once more. His eyes, though often downcast, held the distant glint of a storm, a quiet intensity that spoke of battles fought within, battles no one else had witnessed. He was a creature of habit and necessity, his days governed by the rising and setting of the sun, by the demands of the land, by the gnawing ache of loneliness he rarely acknowledged, even to himself. He had carved a life from nothing, a stark, brutal beauty in its simplicity, yet it was a life perpetually on the brink, always one drought, one harsh winter, one bitter memory away from shattering. And now, into this meticulously constructed, fragile existence, a stranger was coming, bringing with her the promise of an unknown future, and perhaps the unwelcome echo of a past he had painstakingly buried. The air already felt thicker, charged with an anticipation he could not name, a quiet tremor that ran through the very foundations of his solitary world. The cabin, once a monument to his isolation, now stood as a silent witness to an impending intrusion, a testament to a hope he had not known he still possessed. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. The stagecoach, a lumbering behemoth of dust and creaking wood, deposited Clara at the edge of the world. Her silhouette, fragile against the sprawling horizon, seemed utterly out of place amidst the raw, untamed wilderness. She clutched a worn valise, her knuckles white, her gaze sweeping across the desolate expanse, seeking some sign of the life promised in the neatly penned letters. The cabin, a squat, resolute structure of rough-hewn logs, emerged from the hazy distance, an island of human endeavor in an ocean of scrub and rock. It was smaller than she had imagined, starker, lacking the comforting domesticity she had dared to conjure in her mind during the long, arduous journey. This was not a home. It was a defiant stand against the elements, a testament to sheer, brute force. The air itself seemed to hum with an unspoken challenge, a vast, indifferent silence that swallowed the last vestiges of city clamor from her ears. As she stepped down, the ground felt alien beneath her thin boots, a landscape that offered no softness, no easy comfort. Her eyes, accustomed to the veiled light of a city, squinted against the merciless glare of the sun, revealing a starkness in the land that mirrored the starkness in her own heart. She had fled something, a shadow she could not outrun, seeking refuge in this promised solitude, hoping that distance would dull the edges of her own sharp memories. But here, the quiet magnified everything, every whisper of the wind a potential echo of her past. She had sought a blank slate, a new beginning, yet the sheer emptiness of this place threatened to fill her with the very anxieties she had hoped to escape. She saw him then, standing by the cabin, a figure as unyielding and weathered as the landscape itself. His frame was broad, powerful, but carried with a weariness that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. His eyes, when they met hers across the short, dusty distance, were not welcoming but guarded, like a well-worn path that offered no easy passage. A flicker of something unreadable passed through them. Suspicion? Resignation? Before settling into a stony neutrality. He was everything the letters hadn't detailed, a man of few words, his presence a heavy weight in the air. This was not the charming, hopeful man of her imagined future, but a raw, unvarnished truth, demanding an honest reckoning she was not yet ready to give. The silence stretched between them, a tangible presence, filled with the unspoken questions and unvoiced fears of two strangers bound by a desperate pact. The first days were a study in enforced proximity and profound distance. Their movements around the small cabin were precise, almost choreographed, a silent ballet of avoidance. Clara would wake before dawn, the chill of the unheated cabin biting at her, and watch the rancher, Elias, move through his morning rituals, stoking the embers, grinding coffee beans with a steady, rhythmic cadence, his back to her, a wall of unyielding muscle and unspoken thoughts. She sought comfort in the familiar scent of wood smoke and strong coffee, small anchors in an otherwise adrift world. He rarely spoke, offering only terse instructions about chores, his voice a low rumble, devoid of inflection. "Water the garden," he'd say, or "firewood needs stacking," his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond her, as if acknowledging her existence was a concession. Yet Clara, with a quiet intensity, observed him. She saw the meticulous care he took with his tools, the way his calloused hands moved with surprising gentleness over a newborn calf, the shadow that sometimes crossed his face when the wind carried a particular lament. She noticed the slight tremor in his hand when he poured his coffee, the way his jaw would clench, almost imperceptibly, when he thought himself unobserved. These were not the signs of a simple, hard-working man, but of someone deeply wounded, whose strength was as much about enduring pain as it was about physical labor. Her own past, a tangle of betrayals and hushed accusations, often threatened to overwhelm her in the quiet hours of the night. She had carried her own burdens across half a continent, a silent confession that haunted her waking moments. She understood the language of unspoken grief, the weight of secrets held too long. One afternoon, as she hung a fresh-washed sheet on the line, the wind snatched it, sending it swirling towards a thorny bush. Without a word, Elias moved, his stride long and unhurried, plucking it from the barbs before it snagged. He handed it back, their fingers brushing for a fleeting moment. His touch was rough yet not unkind. In that brief contact, a silent acknowledgement passed between them, a recognition of shared fragility in a world that demanded an unyielding exterior. It was a fleeting connection, a whisper in the vast silence gone as quickly as it had appeared, yet it lingered, a subtle shift in the air between them, a fragile thread spun in the desolate quiet. A sudden fierce blizzard descended upon the ranch, trapping them within the confines of the small cabin. The world outside transformed into a maelstrom of white, erasing all landmarks, reducing existence to the immediate space around them. The relentless howl of the wind became a constant companion, a chilling reminder of their isolation. Forced into closer proximity, the meticulous dance of avoidance began to fray. Elias, accustomed to solitary battle against the elements, found himself grudgingly relying on Clara's quiet efficiency. She kept the fire roaring, meticulously patching cracks in the window frames with strips of cloth, her hands surprisingly adept. One evening, as the storm raged, a section of the roof began to leak, a slow, insistent drip threatening to ruin their meager supplies. Elias cursed, grabbing a bucket. "Hold this," he grunted, clambering onto a rickety stool, his broad shoulders straining as he tried to brace the sagging beam. The stool wobbled precariously. Without a word, Clara moved, bracing it with her own body, her small frame lending unexpected stability. Their eyes met, a brief, intense exchange over the roaring storm. In that moment, the raw desperation of their situation stripped away the layers of guardedness. He saw not just a fragile woman, but a steady presence, a quiet strength that complemented his own brute force. For a fleeting instant, the walls around his heart trembled. A fragmented image flickered in his mind. A similar storm years ago, the frantic, futile efforts to save what little he had. The cold, creeping despair as everything crumbled. The sound of splintering wood. The cries. He pushed the memory down, a leaden weight in his chest. "Enough," he rasped, his voice rougher than intended, pulling back from the beam, the immediate crisis averted. Clara merely nodded, her face impassive, but her eyes held a deeper understanding. She had seen the flicker of pain, the ghost of a past wound. The storm outside raged, but within the cabin, a different kind of storm had just begun to gather, threatening to expose the truths they both so carefully concealed. The shared vulnerability, born of necessity, had peeled back a thin layer of their carefully constructed facades, revealing the raw, beating heart of their unspoken loneliness. The blizzard, having sculpted the landscape into a desolate, sparkling tableau, eventually receded, leaving behind a silence even more profound than before. But the forced intimacy of those days had irrevocably altered the dynamic within the cabin. Clara, no longer content with mere observation, began to piece together fragments of Elias's past, like shards of broken pottery. She noticed the way he flinched when the wind whistled through a particular crack in the chimney, a sound that seemed to carry an unseen echo for him. She saw the deep furrows of old scars on his forearms, not from labor, but from something sharper, more violent. The local merchant, a portly man named Silas Abernathy, who arrived weeks later with much-needed supplies, was the first secondary figure to cast a shadow on their fragile peace. Abernathy, with his slicked-back hair and overly familiar grin, carried the insidious aroma of gossip and judgment. His eyes, quick and assessing, lingered on Clara for a moment too long, then flickered to Elias with a knowing, almost pitying glance. "Still wrestling with those ghosts, Elias?" Abernathy boomed, his voice too loud in the quiet cabin, a question thinly veiled as concern. "Folks around here remember what happened. Hard for a man to outrun his own shadow, ain't it?" Elias's jaw tightened, his gaze hardening like tempered steel. "My business is my own, Silas," he retorted, his voice low, a barely contained growl. Abernathy chuckled, a dry, rustling sound like dead leaves. "Indeed. Just hope your new arrangement don't bring more trouble than it's worth. Some things just ain't meant to be out here, no matter how hard you try to build 'em up again." His words, carefully chosen, resonated with Clara. They were not just idle chatter. They were barbs designed to prick, to remind Elias of a past he couldn't escape, and to subtly warn Clara of the man she had bound herself to. As Abernathy packed his wagon, Clara overheard hushed whispers from his young helper about Elias, about a fire, a lost family, and justice that wasn't. The words, disjointed as they were, painted a chilling picture, confirming Clara's growing unease. She began to see the cabin not just as a refuge, but as a monument to a past tragedy, its very foundations built upon ashes. The solitude, once a comfort, now felt like a cage, trapping them both with an untold story that hung heavy in the air, thick as smoke. The unspoken questions finally became too heavy to bear. One evening, after a particularly strained supper eaten in silence, Clara set down her fork with a decisive click that resonated in the quiet. "Silas Abernathy spoke of a fire," she began, her voice steady, though a tremor ran through her hands beneath the table, "and of a lost family. He said justice that wasn't." Elias froze, his hand halfway to his coffee cup. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound, but a palpable weight pressing down on them both. The air grew thick, charged with the energy of a lightning storm about to break. He slowly lowered his hand, his gaze fixed on the flickering lamplight, avoiding her eyes. "Some things are best left buried," he mumbled, his voice hoarse, a plea and a warning intertwined. "Secrets don't stay buried out here, Elias," Clara countered, her voice gaining strength driven by a desperate need for truth, a yearning to understand the man she was bound to, and perhaps to finally unburden herself of her own ghosts. "They fester. They choke the life out of everything." He slowly turned to face her, his eyes dark pools reflecting the lamp's glow, filled with a raw anguish she had not seen before. "My wife and my boy," he began, the words ripped from him, each syllable a shard of glass. "They died in the fire. My old cabin, burned to the ground with them inside." His voice broke, thick with unshed tears. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The raw grief in his eyes was almost unbearable. "But Abernathy spoke of justice," she pressed, her heart pounding with a terrible anticipation. Elias's jaw clenched, his knuckles white against the table. "The fire wasn't accidental. It was set by a man named Jedediah Cole. He was a rival rancher, claimed I'd encroached on his land. A dispute over a fence line, petty squabble, but he took everything." His voice dropped to a near whisper, laden with venom. "They called it an accident. The sheriff, the judge, they all sided with Cole. He had money, influence. I had nothing but my word. They just saw a poor rancher, a broken man. No justice, Clara. None. The bitter truth hung between them, a shroud woven from grief and betrayal. The sheer injustice of it, the cold indifference of the law, painted a stark portrait of the world he inhabited, a world where the powerful crushed the vulnerable with impunity. Clara felt a profound ache in her chest, a resonance with his pain, for she too knew the taste of injustice, the suffocating weight of being unseen, unheard, and unvindicated. His confession, stark and brutal, had not brought distance but a chilling proximity, forging a fragile, desperate bond between two souls scarred by the world's indifference. The revelation of Elias's profound loss, the deliberate, unpunished act that had consumed his family, cast a new, darker shadow over the cabin. The air, already thick with unspoken anxieties, now pulsed with the oppressive weight of his unresolved grief and burning injustice. Clara watched him, saw the deep lines of pain etched around his eyes, the way his hands, capable of such strength, would sometimes tremble when idle. His confession had opened a door, but through it, she saw not only his suffering but a dangerous, smoldering rage that threatened to consume him. This was not just sorrow. It was a thirst for vengeance, an open wound that refused to heal. The days that followed were punctuated by periods of heavy silence and Elias's almost frantic work, as if physical exertion could quell the turmoil within. He would chop wood with a furious intensity, his axe biting deep into the logs, each swing a brutal declaration against an unseen enemy. His usual stoicism began to crack, revealing flashes of bitterness, resentful whispers about Jedediah Cole, the man who had stolen his future. "He walks free, Clara," Elias would mutter, his voice raw with venom, staring out at the vast, empty plains as if Cole's face were painted on the horizon. "He lives in comfort, while my family lies beneath barren earth." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. This man, so strong, so grounded in the earth, was also dangerously untethered by his grief, consumed by a singular purpose that threatened to eclipse everything else. One morning she found a tarnished silver locket hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Elias's room, tucked away with a child's faded drawing. She recognized the locket from the daguerreotype of his first wife. Her fingers traced the cold metal, a profound sense of sadness washing over her. But then, a chilling memory from her own past, a whispered warning from her mother, flickered in her mind. When a man loses everything, Clara, he can become something else entirely, something dangerous. The locket, a symbol of love and loss, now felt like an ominous omen, a stark reminder of the fragile line between justice and vengeance. The cabin, once a symbol of Elias's endurance, began to feel less like a home and more like a tomb for his buried rage, waiting for the opportune moment to erupt. The tension, simmering for weeks, finally erupted under the merciless glare of the noon sun. Elias, driven by an obsessive need to reclaim what was lost, began erecting a new fence line, pushing beyond the traditional boundary, directly encroaching on Jedediah Cole's sprawling, fertile land. He worked with a feverish intensity, his movements precise, deliberate, each post hammered into the earth a defiance, a silent challenge. Clara watched him from the cabin porch, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She knew this act was not about land. It was about pride, about vengeance, about finally forcing Cole to acknowledge his crime. "Elias, stop," she called out, her voice thin against the vastness, knowing it was futile. "This isn't the way." He ignored her, his back rigid, his focus entirely on the brutal task. Then a cloud of dust on the horizon, growing rapidly into a band of riders. Jedediah Cole, a corpulent man with a cruel sneer and eyes like flint, rode at the head, flanked by two of his hired hands. Their arrival was not a parley, but a hostile invasion. Cole dismounted, his boots hitting the dusty ground with an arrogant thud. "What in blazes do you think you're doing, Elias?" he snarled, his voice thick with contempt, his hand resting casually on the pistol holstered at his hip. "This is my land. Always has been. You lost everything, you pathetic worm, and you won't take a speck of what's mine." Elias straightened, his eyes blazing, the years of suppressed rage finally breaking free. "You took everything, Cole?" he roared, his voice cracking with the force of his emotion. "My wife, My son. My home. This land was ours. You burned us out, and you walked away clean. Cole laughed, a chilling guttural sound that scraped against Clara's nerves. A man like you, Elias? Careless with fire, careless with life. You blame others for your own failings. The words, calculated to inflict maximum pain, hit Elias like a physical blow. He lunged forward, a primal scream tearing from his throat, not for land but for retribution, for the agonizing void in his soul. Cole's hired hands moved swiftly, tackling Elias, pinning him to the ground, dusty and defeated. One of them, a brutal-faced man, drew his pistol, pressing it against Elias's temple. One more move, rancher, and you join your family in the dust, he spat. Elias, pinned and helpless, was a portrait of raw, agonizing defeat. Clara watched, horrified, as the brute force of injustice once again crushed the man she was beginning to understand. The air crackled with unspoken threats, the promise of violence hanging heavy, a suffocating shroud over the desolate plains. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation was a silent, suffocating chasm. Elias, bruised and broken, both physically and spiritually, dragged himself back to the cabin. His silence was not just a lack of words, but a profound, almost catatonic withdrawal. He moved like a ghost through the small rooms, his eyes vacant, staring at walls that offered no solace. The rage that had fueled him had been violently extinguished, leaving behind only the ashes of despair. Clara watched him, her own heart aching with a mixture of fear and profound sorrow. She saw a man stripped bare, his last vestige of hope torn away. The land, once a symbol of his defiance, now seemed to mock him, stretching endlessly, indifferent to his pain. He hadn't just lost a fight. He had lost the illusion of justice, the very idea that he could reclaim anything. His grief, long suppressed, now resurfaced with a terrifying intensity, manifesting not in tears, but in a quiet, devastating desolation. He would sit for hours, staring out the window, his shoulders slumped, his once powerful hands limp in his lap. The cabin, which he had built with such painstaking effort, now felt like a cage, trapping him in the suffocating echoes of his past. Clara, feeling the oppressive weight of his despair, knew she had to act. She had fled her own secrets, her own shame, but seeing Elias so utterly broken stirred something fierce within her. She recognized the chilling finality of his despair, the dangerous edge of a soul contemplating surrender. It was then that she remembered the small, ornate wooden box she carried, hidden within her valise, a relic of her own shadowed past. Inside lay not just faded letters but a meticulously kept ledger, evidence of a different kind of crime. Her family, once respected merchants in a distant town, had been ruined, their reputation systematically dismantled by a powerful rival who bribed officials, manipulated ledgers, and ultimately left them destitute, forcing Clara into this desperate arrangement. Her father, unable to bear the shame, had taken his own life. The ledger held names, dates, amounts, a quiet, damning testament to the corrupt forces that had crushed them. It was not a weapon of violence, but a blade of truth, wielded against the very kind of societal indifference that had allowed Jedediah Cole to thrive. It was her own silent scream against injustice, and in Elias's despair, she saw an opportunity for them both to finally break free from their respective prisons of unspoken anguish. Clara approached Elias, the small wooden box held tightly in her hands, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was seated by the window, his gaze lost in the vast, indifferent landscape, a man utterly bereft. "Elias," she began, her voice soft yet resolute, a whisper against the roaring silence of his despair. He did not stir. She knelt beside him, placing the box on his lap. His eyes, unfocused, slowly dropped to the object, then to her face. "I know what it's like," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "to have everything taken, to be left with nothing but shadows and the bitter taste of injustice." She opened the box, revealing not only the faded letters but the meticulously kept ledger, its pages filled with precise, damning entries. "My family. We weren't just ruined by a rival. We were systematically destroyed, Elias. Corrupt men, powerful men, used their influence, their money, to twist the law, to erase us. My father, He couldn't live with the shame. He took his own life. The words spoken aloud for the first time were a release, a confession, a painful echo of his own loss. She placed the ledger in his hands. This is the proof of their lies, of their crimes, and it is not so different from what happened to you. Jedediah Cole has powerful friends, Elias, men who stood to gain from your land, from your silence, men who could make a fire disappear, make a trial vanish. A flicker of something, a spark ignited in Elias's eyes, not rage but a chilling realization. He saw the pattern now, the systemic rot that had consumed them both. The details in Clara's ledger were not just about her family. They hinted at a wider network of corruption, men who profited from the ruination of others, men who could easily have influenced the outcome of his own tragedy. Jedediah Cole, Clara continued, her voice gaining a quiet strength. He's not just a rancher. He is a piece of a larger puzzle. And this ledger could be the key to exposing them all. Not just for us, Elias, but for all the others they have crushed. The shared knowledge of their parallel suffering, the chilling mirror of their injustices, did not lead to despair, but to a newfound clarity. It was a dark, hard-won hope, born not of naivete, but of a grim determination to fight for a justice that extended beyond their individual pain, a truth that could finally break the suffocating grip of their shared, desolate past. The days that followed were not about healing, but about transformation, a shift from passive grief to a purposeful, albeit fragile determination. Elias, still haunted by the specter of his loss, now moved with a different kind of energy, one born not of blind rage, but of a cold, analytical resolve. Clara's ledger, a testament to her own family's ruin, became their shared burden, a map to a hidden darkness. They pored over its meticulous entries, cross-referencing names, dates, and transactions, discovering connections that stretched far beyond Jedediah Cole. It was a vast, insidious web of corruption, touching powerful figures in the local government, the bank, even the sheriff's office. The truth, when fully uncovered, was far more devastating than a simple act of arson. It was a deliberate, calculated conspiracy to seize land and power, leveraging Elias's vulnerability and destroying anyone who stood in their way, including Clara's family. Their moments of despair were still frequent, thick as the dust that coated their cabin. Elias would often lapse into silence, his gaze distant, lost in the ghost of his past family. Clara would find solace in tending the small garden, her hands in the earth, a tangible connection to life amidst the crushing weight of death and betrayal. But now, when darkness threatened to consume them, one would reach out to the other. A quiet word, a shared glance, an unspoken acknowledgement of their intertwined fates. They were no longer just two strangers, bound by a desperate contract, but two survivors scarred by the same systemic cruelty, forging a fragile alliance against a common enemy. The path forward was treacherous, fraught with danger. They knew that powerful men would not relinquish their hold easily, that exposing the truth could mean facing even greater peril. Yet in the shared silence of the desolate plains, amidst the echoes of their personal tragedies, a profound shift occurred. Their individual pains, once isolating, now became a source of collective strength, a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure, to resist, and to find, in the crucible of shared suffering, a profound, if dark, sense of purpose. The cabin, once a symbol of his solitary sorrow, now stood as a quiet beacon of their defiant, albeit dangerous hope. The resolution, when it finally arrived, was not a sudden explosion of triumph, but a slow, arduous unwinding, like the last coils of a long, taut rope. Elias and Clara, armed with the undeniable evidence from the ledger, meticulously gathered more information, quietly cultivating a network of sympathetic, though fearful, allies among the local populace, who had also suffered under the influence of Cole and his powerful associates. They presented their case not through violence, but through a relentless, undeniable cascade of facts, meticulously compiled details of bribery, land theft, and abuses of power. The sheer weight of the evidence, coupled with the rising tide of public discontent that Elias and Clara subtly fostered, finally forced the hand of authorities beyond the local corrupt sphere. Jedediah Cole and his most direct accomplices were eventually brought to a semblance of justice, though the deeper roots of the conspiracy, reaching into the distant capital, remained largely untouched, too powerful to dismantle entirely. This was not the vengeance Elias had once craved, the swift, satisfying retribution. Instead, it was a long, exhausting battle fought in courtrooms and behind closed doors, a bitter victory that offered no resurrection for the dead, no erasing of the past. Elias gained no wealth, no grand reputation, only the cold, hard acknowledgement of the truth. His family's name, once smeared by false accusations of carelessness, was finally cleared. The land, the very cabin he had painstakingly built, was officially recognized as his, free from the shadow of usurpation. But the ghosts remained. He carried them within him, a constant ache, a part of his very being. Clara, too, bore the indelible scars of her own family's ruin, the weight of her father's despair. They learned to live with these shadows, to integrate them into the fabric of their days, recognizing that true healing was not forgetting, but enduring. The ranch, once a monument to Elias's isolated grief, began to breathe again. Together, Elias and Clara slowly rebuilt, not just fences and structures, but a life rooted in a shared understanding, a quiet resilience. Their bond was forged not in fleeting romance, but in the crucible of mutual suffering and a shared fight for truth. There was no grand declaration of love, but a quiet, profound respect, a silent promise of companionship against a world that had tried to break them. The cabin, once a symbol of his solitary sorrow, now held the quiet hum of a shared existence, a testament to endurance, a fragile but unyielding hope. And so the poor rancher, who built his cabin with bare hands and a broken heart, found not a cure for his wounds, but a steadfast companion in the rebuilding, and a quiet, hard-won peace in the stark, beautiful resilience of a shared life.